Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with J. Randy Taraborrelli, the author of Jackie, Public, Private, Secret. He's written more than 20 books on the Kennedys, the Bushes, the Hiltons, and celebrities like Beyonce. Thanks so much for being here, Randy.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity that promotes children's literacy. You, Randy, were not even 30 years old when you found yourself sitting across from Jackie Kennedy in her office at Doubleday, discussing a book that you were working on about Diana Ross. You said she not only wanted you to do the book on Ross, but that she also inquired as to whether you could do one on Michael Jackson. And she said to you, "What is the point of a biography if it doesn't reveal secrets?" That quote evidently stayed with you for all these years because you opened your book on Jackie with that anecdote. So now that you've been writing about her for 25 years, Randy, and I've been reading about her for 25 years, I'm wondering when you realized that there were still secrets to tell about Jackie Kennedy, someone who has likely had more written about her than any other first lady, and probably almost certainly has had more written about her than any other first lady. So when did you realize there were still secrets to be told?
Evan, I think I realized it about 2 years ago that there were still some mysteries where Jackie's concerned. You know, I've written 5 books about the Kennedys, and Jackie's always been a character in each of the books, but I've never tackled her sort of from cradle to grave, you know, her entire story. There are probably 100 books about Jackie, and I have them all. And when I began this book, I decided I wasn't even going to finish it unless I could be sure that I was going to give my readers something fresh and new. And I realized that all of the other books were looking at Jackie through the eyes of the Kennedys, through the eyes of, you know, her in-laws, the family she married into. And very seldom, if ever, was she viewed through the eyes of her family, the Auchinclosses, the Bouviers, the Lees. And I thought, how interesting is that? You know, and I just felt like I think that maybe it could be said that people put on a certain facade for their in-laws and that they're more organic and true and authentic with their own families. And using that premise, I decided to take a look at Jackie through the eyes of her stepfather, Hugh Auchincloss, who has never been written about before, her mother, Janet Auchincloss, her half-sister, Janet, who's never been written about, her half-brother, Jamie, her side of the family, as opposed to the Kennedys. And in doing that, I got to tell you, I found a lot of new information.
We're going to get to all those people. But before we do, I want to ask, I am fascinated by her fascination, as you describe in your introductions and your forward, her fascination with other famous people. But you say she seldom opened up, and that in fact, she acknowledged that she had a public life, what she called her private life, and then she had a secret life. How does a biographer go about getting to that essential truth of Jackie, or really anyone, but a truth that she acknowledged that she would never show?
Well, I think that, you know, that's a challenge, of course. But if you have the cooperation of family members and of intimates and people who really knew her well, such as I did with her half brother Jamie Auchincloss, or her lover and longtime friend Jack Warnicki, and so many others, you're able to get to the essence of who she was as a woman, the sort of the secret life that she didn't share with many people. And I think that when my readers read the book, you know, the one thing that I was with this book was I just didn't want the reviewer to go through it and pick out certain buzzwords like assassination and Aristotle Onassis and you know Doubleday and Michael Jackson, certain buzzwords that are associated with Jackie, and say, "Oh man, this is just the same old stuff." That was my nightmare, and so I just made very, very certain that whatever ended up in this book was going to be new and could be viewed as private or secret, because I think that my job as a biographer has always been to invade the privacy of my subjects, and with that in mind, I set about doing that with Jackie in this book.
I don't know if bitter is the right word, but I've been reading about the Kennedys and certainly Jackie for the better part of my life at this point. I'm 40 years old, so certainly for 30 years or maybe even 35, depending on what you count as a book. I've been aware of and reading about Jackie and watching movies and documentaries. And I always found that beneath that smile that she would show in public, that there was some bitterness. I don't know if that's the right word, but there always seemed to be this sort of other layer that didn't take very long to get to. And I was really struck by this scene, and you mentioned him just now, John Warnicki, who was visiting her in her apartment after she was diagnosed with cancer. And she literally begins putting letters written to her into the fire. And you say in the book very aptly, she loved history, and now here she is destroying history. What does that scene say to you about how far she went to protect this sort of mystique that surrounds her?
Well, I think it could be viewed that way, Evan, that she was protecting her own mystique, but I see it differently. And John saw it differently. And what he came to and what I came to after talking to him about it, and he was sitting right there with her as they were doing this, throwing these letters into the fire. She felt very strongly that if she wrote a letter, that belonged to the world. And certainly we have, without exaggeration, hundreds of letters from Jackie in her own handwriting.
Meaning that if she wrote a book to someone else, she assumed that at some point it would be unearthed by either a biographer, or they might flash it the first chance they could get to a reporter or something like that.
You're exactly right, Evan. Yes. But she felt very strongly that people who wrote her letters, private citizens, people that she loved, or family members, even certain celebrities who wrote to her, that their letters to her were not fair game, and she just felt that she needed to protect them because she was such a public person that any letter that was written to her by her mother, for instance, would most certainly end up in the public domain somehow. And so she wanted to protect her loved ones. And this was sort of her final way, her final gesture, if you will, of protecting her loved ones by incinerating private letters that they had sent to her. Not, by the way, incinerating letters that she wrote to them, because we have those, but we often don't have the other side.
And did she acknowledge that what she was doing away with would be valuable to somebody like yourself one day, but that she just didn't think it was appropriate?
Yes, it's what we're talking about here is a real paradox, but she is a woman of complete contrasts and paradoxes. I mean, that's just what I've found over the years, 23 years of writing about her in different contexts. And as much as she valued history, and we all know that she did, she also valued privacy, and she was able to find a balance. I think, in my mind's eye, I can imagine her, after having conversations with her, I can imagine her saying to herself, look, they've got all this, but they're not going to get this. They have enough, right?
Yeah. How much more do you need?
Yeah. How much more do you need? You've got like 500 letters that I've written. Do you really need this one letter from my mother? Well, of course, I would love to have that letter. I want it very badly, in
Right.
fact. But you can't have everything you want, and I think that's the her reasoning.
As I was going through your book, I almost felt like this sort of image hit me of Jackie sort of lived this life that was almost like the car wreck theory. Not to suggest she was destructive or anything like that, but I feel like it has been impossible for me and maybe other readers to look away from the trauma that was inflicted on her by sitting next to her own husband while he was murdered in public. Um, she had the inhuman experience of having to deal with all this infidelity that he just flaunted and did millions of, okay, not millions, but thousands of times while they were married. How important is it to look away from those car wrecks, so to speak, and to pull them aside and to look more at who exactly she was while pulling away those really difficult things she went through?
Well, I think that's a good point, and of course, that's what I endeavored to do with this book. But I will say that the car wreckness of it all, if you will, the tragedy of it all, of Dallas in particular, is hard to look away from when you think about the fact that she never got over it. And as I wrote in my book,
I'm sorry, what didn't she get over? Did she not get over the fact that she was sitting there, or the fact that she lost her husband?
I believe that she never got over the fact that she witnessed the horrible loss of her husband. I think that, well, I know that, John Warnicki, who we mentioned earlier, had a conversation with her, as I wrote in my book, toward the end of her life when she was being treated for cancer. And he asked her specifically if she had any regrets. And her response to that question was that she did. She regretted the fact that she allowed that one moment in time to, as she put it, poison the rest of her life. And she said that she got past the assassination, but she never got over it. And in true Jackie spirit, and really, I think it's an example of her courage and also, her determination. She said to him that she believed that if she just had 10 more good years, she'd be able to finally come to terms with that trauma. And imagine it, by this time, she had been dealing with it for 30 years. Yet she felt that all she needed was 10 more years to handle it, you know? And I think that that really says a lot about PTSD and what people who suffer from PTSD deal with.
Mm.
I think that, based on Jackie's experience, it seems to me that you never really get over it. Even if you do get past it and you continue to live your life, you're still haunted by the memory of this horrible thing that occurred. And she definitely was. So to answer your original question, you try to look away from the sort of car wreck that we described, but the car wreck is something that she never was able to look away from
Mm.
in her own life. And so I think it's not necessarily something that we can look away from either in
In the
talking about her and trying to analyze her.
in the dozens of books on John Kennedy that I've read, we often meet Jackie in her late 20s when they meet. And then there might be a brief description of her as a little girl and who she was born into and the families and all that. But they really breeze right through it to sort of get to the political implications of what John Kennedy needed in a wife, in a political wife. Who was she as a little girl? Let's go back to her earliest days. Who were John and Janet Bouvier?
Well, I love that question because it's so true. In every book that you read about JFK, you meet Jackie when he meets her, and then I mean, I've read books where her mother is actually a footnote where it would say as a footnote with an asterisk, Jacqueline's mother was Janet Lee Bouvier
Right.
Auchincloss.
I'm on the
Period.
record. Let's just move on to the next thing. Yeah.
Yes. Um, Jackie was born and raised in New York. Her mom was Janet uh, Bouvier. Her father was Jack Bouvier. She was the apple of her father's eye, and she was, you know, she loved her mom, but her mom was very critical and it could be very difficult. But her mother said in 1967 in an interview that I found that was never published from Good Housekeeping, her mom said, I was not going to raise weak daughters. I'm sorry. She said that maybe I made some mistakes, and I'm sure that my daughters would agree that I did. However, I was not going to raise weak daughters. And so that's where Janet was coming from in the raising of Jackie. She wanted her to be tough and she wanted her to be strong. And thank God she did, because Jackie needed that armor, as it would turn out. Jackie moved in with Hugh Auchincloss when she was 13, when her mom married Hugh Auchincloss. Hugh was her beloved stepfather, who I think in this book my readers will get to know in a whole new way, because he's never really been written about before. I mean, that's not even hyperbole. This man has never been written about before, and so his son Jamie Auchincloss was a major source of mine, and Jamie was Hugh's son and Janet's only son, and it doesn't get much closer than that to the parent than the child. Um, and anyway, to continue, Jackie, Hugh allowed Jackie to be able to have a very nice life. She traveled abroad on his dime. She went to the best schools. She learned different languages. She became a singularly unique person. So by the time she met JFK, she was somebody that could stand toe to toe with him or with any other man. And she was formidable.
Are we able to identify activities, sports, hikes, interests, movies, ambitions that she had?
Well, certainly not sports, but she loved about the ballet, and she loved arts and painters, and she loved writing. She loved reading. She was a very imaginative young woman, but she was also a loner, and she was not given to making a lot of friends. Jamie has a great story that I love. He talks about once Jackie had a friend of hers over to their home, Hammersmith Farm in Newport, where Hugh Auchincloss raised Jackie and her sister Lee and Jamie and his sister Janet. And they were all so happy that Jackie had somebody coming over for the weekend, because that was very, very rare. And Janet was just beside herself, the mom, because she thought this was just great that my daughter has a friend. And I don't even know if I wrote this in the book. I think I didn't. And as they were getting ready to leave, um, the young girl turned to Jackie and she said, "Oh, Jackie, this was so much fun. When can we get together again?" And Jackie thought it over and she said, "Oh, I don't know, maybe a year." Right? Maybe in a year.
Are there thoughts of her becoming a professional woman as she would later in life, or is her childhood sort of engineered to kind of follow what was a preordained gender role?
Well, her mom had the preordained gender role in mind for Jackie, and that's how Jackie ended up with JFK, because JFK was originally interested in Jackie's sister Lee. Jackie's sister Lee was only 19 at the time. JFK was in his early 30s. Jackie was 23, and it was the mom, Janet Auchincloss's idea that Jackie needed to get settled, in quotes, and by settled I mean back in the 1950s, women needed to be settled, meaning married and have children by the time they were at least 23 years old, or something was wrong. And Jackie was 23 and she was still single. So Janet felt, we need to get you settled, and you need to be with JFK, and we'll deal with Lee later. And so she pushed Jackie toward the direction of JFK, and that's how Jackie ended up with JFK.
So were you able to diagnose anything in her childhood that would draw her psychologically to these famous wealthy men, and not just JFK, but who she would marry later on too, and who she would spend a lot of time with? These wealthy men who she's drawn to live complicated, debonair, lives. And I don't know if the word snooty is right, but these guys clearly were of a certain strata of society. Could you identify anything psychologically there?
Well, I think it's a good question, Evan, and I think that yes, I think that these men all reflected back to Jackie, her own father, Jack Bouvier, who was, he was wealthy at times. He had money at times, and he was flamboyant. He was exciting. He was handsome, like JFK. He was charismatic, like Onassis, and he was older, and he took care of Jackie the way JFK took care of Jackie, the way Onassis took care of Jackie, the way Jack Warnke took care of Jackie. So I think that it can be really said that if in fact it's true that some women end up marrying their fathers, I think that might be the case with Jackie. To answer your question.
JFK is famous for having lots of family drama. And there have been many, many, many books written about them, not just yours. But there was, and I didn't know this, there was no shortage of it for Jackie either. Her half sister dated John Kerry, evidently. She had a half brother who was gay, and that became a family drama. How did her navigation of family conflict foreshadow her proclivity to develop these public, private, and secret lives?
Well, everything that you're saying is true, and what's interesting about it is that people didn't know anything about any of that.
I didn't, and as I said, I mean, I've got 36 books on JFK
right.
sitting a foot and a half from me. Didn't know any of it.
That's what's so fascinating that like I asked John Warnke, how in the world were you able to keep a 3-year romance secret?
Yeah, I mean, with Jackie Kennedy. I mean, yes. Not a woman down the street.
She's the most famous woman in the world. They were together from 1964 to 1967. He planned to marry her. Yet, if you go back and Google John Warnke and Jackie Kennedy, the only thing that's going to come up is my book and all the articles about my book. There are no articles back from 1964 about these two people, not a single one. And who knew she had a half sister named Janet? Who knew that she was taking care of her mother in the 1980s when her mother was, diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and Jackie became her primary caretaker? Who knew that she gave her sister Janet Jr. Blood treatments in order to combat Janet's cancer? I mean, when she told Jack Warnke that she had 3 lives, public, private, and secret, she really did mean that. And I think that you couldn't do this today with quite the same way. I think social media has made it impossible for celebrities to have these kinds of secrets.
Yeah, guess who I saw in my elevator today? Jackie Kennedy, right?
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, right on Twitter immediately.
Yeah, you take a picture of her with your phone, and there it is.
Yeah.
And so I think she was of a time and place when it was easier to have a private life, and she knew, like John Warnke told me, we didn't blab it. Like they could have very easily, been seen together in public, and that would have taken care of it. I mean, again, anytime Jackie would have been seen with somebody as handsome as John Warnke in a restaurant or something, pictures would have been taken, and the jig would be up. But they managed to not do that. I think it's incredible.
I love asking about process. What were your sources for this book? Hundreds of hours of interviews, as you said, I assume done over many decades. Were there individual secrets in the interviews themselves, or did you have to reconstruct them by comparing what people said to you in interviews with items already in the public record.
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
That's a good question. You know, I try not to look at items in the public record that much. You know, I try not to be too influenced by what's been written and what's been said by others, because I'll tell you, if you start going down that rabbit hole, and start trying to figure out what people have written about Jackie over the years, and what other books have said about her, and how it's not worth it for me. What matters to me are my sources, not other people's sources, right? What matters to me are my sources. And over the course of 25 years, going back to Jackie Ethel and Joan, which came out in 2000, and which I started researching a couple years before that, I've been able to amass an incredible amount of material, taped interviews with people who are no longer with us. And I was able to go back over all of those interviews, Secret Service agents and family members and friends, and find the stories that didn't apply to the books that they were interviewed for, but now apply to this one. A Secret Service agent who was interviewed for perhaps the Kennedy heirs, about John Kennedy Jr., who had an amazing story about Jackie that didn't make it into the Kennedy heirs, which then made it into this book. So I was able to draw from all of that. And then plus, of course, we did new interviews for this book with many people who felt more open and able to talk about Jackie, since she's been gone for 30 years. And the combination of all of that is what the book is really really about. And again, I try to stay away from other people's books, and I try to stay away from other articles and what's in the public eye, because that's just a losing battle.
This is sort of the unaskable question, but I am going to ask it anyway. This is my show. How did you uncover? How much did you uncover that you wanted to put in the book, but just couldn't because you couldn't find either a second source, or it just seemed like it was something that might be interesting but not provable?
Well, gosh, Evan, that's an incredibly good question that people don't generally ask, because I think people like to think that everything I know, and I guess from an advertising standpoint, it would be a good idea to put this forth.
My brain is on this book. Yeah,
is in this book.
Yeah.
But in fact, I learned a long time ago as a biographer that just because something is true doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be known. And, sometimes it happens, and that, not even sometimes, it often happens that I'll have a story that I really need to consider whether or not it's going to be damaging to somebody else, whether or not it's out of context. Perhaps it would be in better context if I could have another source who was there. Sometimes a person who I believe and who I trust has a story that is a dynamite story, but he was the only one who knew it, and I can't back it up with another source. And so I tell my staff of researchers that there's not any story in the world that is so important that we need to jeopardize our credibility with it. I still have a strong readership, even if I don't have that one little story that I might love, but my readers will never know existed because we might decide not to use it.
All right, back to our fascinating answer, by the way. Thanks for so if anyone listening to this is a journalist, and I am, that's really good advice that carries over not just from books, but to journalism and to reportage. So thanks for sharing all that. Fascinating. Back to our plot. Why didn't she want to move? It reminded me of Melania a little bit here. Why didn't she want to move into the White House?
It is very Melania, isn't it? That Jackie didn't want to move into the White House because for a simple reason, and maybe an immature reason, but don't forget she was about 30. People tend to forget how young she was. She just didn't like it. And Mamie Eisenhower took her on a tour, and she just thought it was terrible. And she didn't want to live there. And she said that she was not going to move in, and she wasn't going to raise her children there. There was just no way. She just didn't like it. So they,
Who could blame
her family, Janet and Hugh, her mom and stepfather, they came up with an idea that perhaps she could live there part-time and live with them the rest of the time. And Jackie was very hopeful, and she called JFK and she proposed this idea, and he said, absolutely not. The first lady needs to live at the White House. That's just the end of the story. And Jackie was really put off by that. And her mom was the one who said to her, look, if you don't like it, then maybe you should do something about it. Why don't you fix it? Why don't you restore it back to its original glory? Instead of, like, Janet was the kind of woman who just did not like to hear complaints. She said, instead of complaining about it, why don't you do something about it? And Janet was also very dramatic, and she did say something along the lines of, all of this is very much beneath you, Jacqueline. And then she stormed off, and Hugh Auchincloss turned to Jackie and he said, she's not wrong. And that really was, I believe, the root, the origin, as it were, of Jackie's decision to famously restore the White House, a restoration which she became very well known for.
There's an interview with JFK, and I'm not even sure when. I mean, I believe it was done during his White House years, but there's an interview with JFK, and I don't even know how famous it is, but I remember seeing it, where he's asked about women in politics. And he basically, maybe he was just asked about what he wanted for his children. And he said, I want politics to be for not just the boys, but for the girls too. And I'm wondering how much of a political mind Jackie had. It's almost never discussed in books. Did she view politics the way a politician does, or was it just sort of what her husband was into, and I do my own stuff, and that's that?
Well, what's interesting to me about that is where you really get a sense of her political mind is in the oral tapes, the interviews with Jackie that Arthur Schlesinger did, which were released a few years ago by her daughter, Caroline Kennedy. There, I don't know, maybe 15 CDs. I mean, it's an unbelievable amount of CDs. And if you listen to them, Jackie really talks in depth about, her feelings about politics and the key characters. And she discusses the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. I drew from a lot of these interviews in my book.
Was she good on the details of that stuff? I mean, did she really know backwards and forwards?
She's very good on the details, and she has strong opinions, and I think that it's really interesting to hear her talk about something like the Bay of Pigs, because when do you ever hear that? So I would recommend for anybody who's really interested in hearing more about that, and about her points of view politically, and about the people that she approved of, and also the people that she didn't approve of. And she talks a lot about the Johnsons and Lyndon Johnson. And I used a lot of these quotes in the book, but I think it's really worth hearing her voice is what's really interesting.
A fascinating voice too. It's so different.
Yeah.
Would her marriage to JFK have lasted forever if that awful thing didn't happen in Dallas?
Well, that's such a good question, and and of course we don't know the answer, but we can speculate two things. First of all, we can imagine that if he had continued with his infidelity, that she would not have put up with it into the 70s, because she became a different kind of woman in the 70s. And for instance, when Joan Kennedy asked her in the 60s what Joan should do about Ted's infidelity, Jackie said, well, you have to put up with it. It's
Right.
just the way these men are. What I wrote in the book, what I think is very interesting, is the fact that after Patrick, their baby, died, JFK began to recommit himself to their marriage.
Yeah, and there's a wonderful book about that, by the way. I think it's called The Last 100 Days. It's by Thurston Clark, and anyone wants to read it, it's fantastic. After you read Randy's book, but go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And that is a really good book. I do love that book. JFK and Jackie were planning to build an estate in Newport, right next to the Auchinclosses, which says a lot, because the Auchinclosses had mixed emotions about JFK for a lot of his life because of the way he treated Jackie. And they were very excited by this time that he was going to be living next door with Jackie. And you have to imagine that if this had happened, that they might have been able to sustain their marriage, and that they might have been able to be a real family, because after Patrick died, he did recommit himself to the marriage, and he let go of one of the women he was seeing very much of. Her name was Mary Meyer. And I think that it's possible that they might have been able to put their marriage together. It's also possible that maybe he would have gone back to his unfaithful ways. And if that had been the case, Jackie would not have put up with it.
How did she wind up with Aristotle Onassis? And I was really struck by this, finding that she didn't want intimacy with him.
Well, one of the characters in this book that people have never heard of before, another one of them, is Artemis Onassis, who was Onassis's sister. And I found that she was really sort of the architect behind the marriage of Jackie with Ari. Because Jackie had confided in Artemis that she was having financial problems and that the Kennedys were not taking care of her. And she needed to do something to something practical to have, the money that she felt she needed to support herself and her children. And it was Artemis's idea that, well, maybe, my brother might be the answer to your problems. And her brother Onassis had been involved in a long-term affair with the opera star Maria Callas, who Artemis did not approve of. And she certainly thought Jackie would be better for her brother than Maria Callas. And so she sort of put this into motion, and Jackie, she liked Onassis, and in some ways I think that she loved him. I think you get a different picture of him in this book than you've ever gotten of him before. I think he's more interesting in this book because you see him through the eyes of his in-laws, and that's very rare. You never think that Onassis had a mother-in-law, for instance, and he did, and that's Janet. And there are lots of interesting Janet Onassis stories in this book that really bring Onassis to light in a different way. But to answer your question, it happens, as I wrote in my book, it happens sometimes that you have sex with somebody and you're like, no, that's just never going to happen again, right? But as I wrote in my book, that's often the case, but it's more complicated when there is maybe $30 million on the table. Then you have a different set of, how is there a world, Jackie asked Onassis, where we can be together and I can be your wife and you get to be married to the most famous woman in the world, and I get some money and I get the protection that I need for myself and my children, but we don't have to have intimacy. Can that happen? And he said yes. He was able to continue his affair with Maria Callas, and she accepted it. She had the coping skills in place already from what she went through with JFK, so that wasn't as much of a stretch for
Yeah, I
her.
mean, how is she so transactional? I mean, that seems really, maybe for a man, we're used to hearing men be that way, but we're not as used to hearing women be that way.
Well, I think that she got it from her mom, because her mom was very transactional and married Hugh Auchincloss for the exact same reasons. You know,
Um, it's crazy to think, I remember vaguely when she died. I was about 11 years old. I remember vaguely hearing that Jackie Kennedy had died. I guess to me, because of how long ago her husband died, I felt like she was an old woman. That's the impression of an 11-year-old. She was only 64. My parents, who will hear this, they're very, very young, and they're a little bit older than she was. So 64 years old is a really young woman, and she could still be alive today, which I think really strikes me. She could still be 94 or 95 years old. What do you think she'd be doing right now if she were to have lived this long?
well, it's funny that you say that, because Barbara Walters died last year, and she was, I don't know, she was like in her mid-90s, and then I was struck by the fact that she and Jackie were born the same year, and she lived 30 years longer, and that's just astonishing
It's
to
a
me.
lifetime for some people. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that Jackie would have, she would have continued in publishing. I believe she probably would have written her own memoir. I think that even though she said she would never do it, I think that she would have been around publishing for so many years that she would not have been able to resist it, and that would have been very
And if she wanted
interesting.
money, that would have been a way to get a few bucks too.
Oh, definitely. And I but I shudder to think of her reaction to seeing her son get killed in a plane crash.
No
I
kidding.
don't know how she would have been able to survive that.
Oh,
Um,
I remember that
I
day.
had this idea a couple of years ago about a television series called "If She Had Lived," and and my idea was to begin the show with the cancer diagnosis, but at the end of episode one, she's in remission and she's cured. And then what happens then? What would happen to Jackie then? And I just think it's interesting. We'd love to know, because I think we want her to be happy. You know, we would want her to be happy.
What advice would Jackie have for today's young women?
I think Jackie would say, don't forget who you are. Don't lose yourself with in your marriage or in your relationships with men. There's a point in my book after she and Onassis were finished where she ended up with another Greek, and he was a director, and he's somebody that has never been identified before. His name is not in any index of any Jackie book, and we found this man who had this relationship with Jackie, an affair with Jackie, and he didn't understand why she wanted to take a job at Viking Press as an editor. She was a very wealthy woman. Why are you wanting to make $200 a week? And it became a big issue between the two of them. And he said, "Look, it's either going to be me or this job." And she chose the job. And she said, anytime a man makes you choose between him and yourself and what you want and you need, and you choose him, you're in trouble. So I think her advice would be, don't forget who you are, and don't forget what you want, and don't lose yourself in your marriage.
I love asking about dedication, so I'm going to ask about yours. Your dedication for this book says, for all those who have faced the darkest trauma of their lives and struggled to move through or move on, and for the peace that may come one day after the crucible in the light of a path towards acceptance. That's who the book is for. How did you craft that dedication, and why?
I crafted the dedication by thinking about all the people that I know who suffer from PTSD, and all the people who I don't know who would read this book and see their PTSD reflected back to them through Jackie and through her experience. And I wanted people to understand that they're not alone, and that what they're feeling has been felt and has been dealt with by many, many, many others. And we are not alone. And that's really the whole point of writing biography for me. That the whole point has always been for my readers to see their experiences reflected back to them through the experience of others who they would think they would have nothing in common with.
Do you
But
think it's
it turns out we have a lot in common with others who may be celebrities, but who are also human beings, right? And that's the common denominator is our humanity.
do you think it's easier for people to handle the similarities and handle the content of your book, given the chapters are really refreshingly short? The book is relatively long. It's like 400 or 500 pages, but the chapters are short. And I noticed that. Is that done on purpose?
Evan, that's my way of tricking my readers into finishing the book. Because I have found that if you're in bed at night and you're reading the book and you have a chapter that's only got 3 pages, and you look at the next chapter and it's got 2 pages, you say, okay, you know what? Let me just read those 2 pages, and then you read that chapter, and the next chapter's got 4 pages, and let me just read those 4 pages. Whereas if the next chapter has 50 pages, you're like, oh my gosh, I'll wait till tomorrow.
I gotta go to bed. Yeah. I love that.
Yeah.
All right. You're working on TV right now. I'd ask you who you're going to do next, but I assume you're focusing on this TV series at this moment, right?
I actually am. As soon as the writer's strike is over, I'm going to get back to work on the Jackie TV series, which we started before the strike, and which I'm really, really excited about. But I will say that I just signed another book deal as well with the St. Martin's Press.
Are you allowed to? Are you allowed to? No. Okay. Well, I'll wait.
I can't say, but I will say this: that when it comes out, you will say, "Oh, of course, that makes perfect sense."
Huh.
Yeah.
Okay. Looking forward to that. J. Randy Taraborrelli, the author of Jackie, Public, Private, and Secret. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Evan. I appreciate it.
Check out the book. Check out his website, which is jrandytaraborrelli.com. He's on the website, formerly known as Twitter, at jrtaraborrelli. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity that promotes children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports, History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.